Think we could go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar, Minneapolis and Beyond, Lessons from U.S. Incinerator Fights. My name is Maria Guillen, Communications and Network Development Manager at Gaia, and I'll be your moderator today. This webinar is brought to you by the Zero Burn Coalition and the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives. The Zero Burn Coalition consists of over 70 organizations and hundreds of individuals currently focused on shutting down the HERC waste incinerator in Minneapolis. Gaia is a global network of over 1,000 grassroots and national organizations in 92 countries working together at the intersection of waste and environmental justice. As a reminder for folks joining us, please use the Q&A to submit questions for our panel. We saved just under an hour for our presentations and panel, and this webinar will continue for Q&A at the top of the hour. We are recording this webinar, but we'll stop recording for the Q&A and press briefing. Before we begin, I want to provide some context for what brings us all together today. Since our beginning, Gaia's work in the U.S. has focused significantly on supporting communities challenging municipal solid waste incineration. We work with grassroots activists in impacted communities to provide technical assistance and support, amplify their organizing, and connect them with other members nationally and globally. All of these groups, the Minnesota Environmental Justice Table, Valley Improvement Projects, Breathe Free Detroit, and South Baltimore Community Land Trust, were once part of the Failing Incinerators Project, a Gaia-coordinated initiative that worked with a cohort of EJ organizations across the country, pushing for the shutdown of their respective aging incinerators. To date, 5 of the 10 incinerators have been shut down, including in Stanislaus County and in Detroit, which we'll hear more about later. Although we don't meet formally as a cohort anymore, the work, the fostered relationships, and the collaboration continues, and that solidarity is what brought this webinar together. Today, we'll hear from folks around the country reflect on their campaigns, but first, I'm going to pass it to MNEJ Table's campaign director, Isro Hirath, to give us a little more context on what's been happening in Minneapolis. Isro?
Thank you, Maria. I also want to extend my appreciation to everyone who has taken their time to join us this morning. My name is Isuru. I'm also a resident and a community member who lives less than a mile from the HERC trash burner. Before I begin, I also want to start recalling some of the names of those that were executed by the state over the last decade in Minnesota. Fong Lee, 2006, Jamar Clark, 2015, Philando Castile, 2016, Justine Damon, 2017, George Floyd, 2020, Dalal Eid, 2020, Dante Wright, 2021, Winston Biggie Smith, 2021, Linnell Frazier, 2021, Amir Locke, 2022, Ricky Kopp Jr., 2023, Renee Good, 2026, Alex Preddy, 2026. To ground our discussion today, it is important to name our political reality. Although the federal surge appears to be slowing down, they're not collaborating to normalize their presence in the city. However, these tactics of fear and violence are not new. As the occupation of these lands has never ended, Black and brown communities and the poor have always been the target of state violence. From Fort Snelling to the Dakota 38, from Standing Rock to George Floyd, right here in Minneapolis, the patterns are the same. This land has always been governed through violence. HERC is simply the modern version of that project, administered through environmental policy. The movement to close incinerators nationwide tells a story of erasure, redesigning of spaces deemed sacred into testing ground for extraction and profiteering. In Minnesota, HERC is one of the 7 incinerators currently in operation. Although Minnesota is often painted as progressive, we rely heavily on burning waste as a form of solid waste management. 6 of the 7 incinerators are located in environmental justice communities, And Minnesota has the third highest number of incinerators across Turtle Island. These are political decisions to concentrate harm where people have been made disposable. Regulatory agencies and the state institutions answer to industry, not to our communities. And in the case of the HERC, the Hennepin County Board, under the leadership of Irene Fernando, continues to delay the closure, misinform the public, minimize its health impacts, and target and surveil the members of our coalition while telling our communities this closure must wait. Now we're in a position under siege by the federal government. Our community members are in deliberation to risk their lives through a hunger strike to shut down the HERC. So the county could follow through on their promises to close the facility. Why is it necessary to take such measures so Hennepin County will follow through its promises to the public? Why is it that we have to think about risking our lives on a federal occupation like this to shut down a simple incinerator that's in the middle of the city? This is why when we talk about waste management, we do not get lost in the technical and in the industrial and the bureaucratic framing that obscures how these issues affect our lives. So today, I want to offer another perspective on waste management, grounded in the fundamental questions our coalition considers to think outside of policy jargon. Who decides which regions which regions and people are worthy of sacrifice? Who is more likely to bear the burden of disposability? I think of waste as extending the logic of empire where extraction, experimentation, and exploitation are all maintained together. HERC does not simply manage waste to create energy, it also has an underlying logic as a mechanism of enforcement, containment, and displacement. It serves a purpose to maintain the color line in the racial order, where white bodies are valued and black and brown bodies are discarded. These facilities poison our air, and just like ICE, HERC functions as an apparatus of the ongoing occupation. Minnesota stands at a critical juncture for and building a multiracial popular movement against the capitalist forces of fascism and ecological destruction. We threaten their imperial logic. There's a real possibility of a multiracial working class movement here. As the empire struggles to maintain dominance, it lashes out like a wounded animal, intensifying state violence in our neighborhoods, and proximity to whiteness no longer guarantees such a protection in Minnesota. This panel is about resistance, what it means to build power under struggle. The opposition relies on predictable tactics to divide us, but collective will overcomes their oppression. When we come together, when we build leverage and political power, we will able to shut this incinerator down. And also, importantly, we're building frontline leaders to develop their leadership, build their courage, and transform their lives to build political will that they never have experienced before. So in today's panel, we uplift the stories of working people coming together, building broad coalitions to build trust, to abolish the old ways of social and cultural domination that we have been forced to believe is normal. Our position is clear. We believe in peace. We believe in prosperity. We believe in dignity of all human beings. Fighting incinerators is part of a democratic struggle for clean water and clean air. And today, before we begin, we extend our solidarity to all those in struggle across the globe and those who have sacrificed their lives protecting our precious earth and way of life.
Thank you, Isaru, for that powerful grounding. With that, we'll now hear from directly from the groups about the work they've been leading on the ground. First up is South Baltimore Community Land Trust. We'll hear from Greg Sawtell, Zero Waste Just Transition Director, and Carlos Sanchez, Youth Outreach Specialist.
Hello everyone. Thank you all for giving us a space to speak today. And we'll be talking about our campaign for Just Transition to Zero Waste in Baltimore. And just to highlight this image in front of you, it's a image of a resident-led and community-led shutdown of the incinerator following a broken promise by political leaders to end the city contract. And we can go on to the next slide. So, for a bit of context, for decades, we in South Baltimore have lived with the consequences of Baltimore's waste system. Since the 1980s, our communities has hosted a large trash incinerator, burning waste from both Baltimore City and Baltimore County. And today, it still remains the largest single source of air pollution in the city. And we also are home to the nation's largest medical waste incinerator, compounding pollution and health risks in neighborhoods that are already overburdened. These facilities didn't just end up here by accident, they reflect a long-standing decision to concentrate harm in our communities. Next slide, please. And Greg, I'll pass it on to you.
Thanks, Carlos. My involvement in this work started about 15 years ago when, in addition to the concentration of polluting industry in South Baltimore, there was a plan to add even more in what would have been the nation's largest trash incinerator, less than a mile away from the school that Carlos recently graduated from. And what you see on the left is this was a point in the campaign where we were starting to build momentum and become successful in discrediting this greenwashed project, which had the endorsement of the failed presidential candidate who was governor at the time of Maryland, Martin O'Malley, and the mayor at the time of Baltimore. And that's the CEO popping out of the smokestack in the middle. And we went from a project that was destined to succeed. They had managed to distort Maryland policy to make trash renewable energy, and we've gotten millions of dollars in subsidies and gotten dozens of contracts from public institutions, including high schools and art museums and all sorts of others. And we went from that, where everyone thought it was destined to happen, to spending 5 years, largely led by the generation of high school students that came before Carlos, to having the courage to ask a basic question Suru laid out, which is, when a community is already overburdened with so much, how can it even be considered to add something more? And there was a lot of just from lived experience and expectation that any effort to stop this was doomed because it had happened so many times before. And so we were able to stop this proposal through lots of means, including civil disobedience, lots and lots of different kinds of research, ultimately stopped it from happening. And from that energy grew the South Baltimore Community Land Trust, which focuses on two things: community owned and managed research that allows us to translate into a lot of different actions, such as creating a zero waste infrastructure in the city, reshaping policy that allows communities to exist, and also actually start to develop the things that communities want and need. So in our case, it's a lot of permanently affordable housing. So I'll pass it back to Carlos.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you for going to the next slide. So, like Greg mentioned, we pushed the city to confront its reliance on burning and burying waste, and we helped launch Baltimore's zero waste planning process and formed the South Baltimore Community Land Trust to support community-owned and community-managed research and development rooted in our own priorities. We can go on to the next slide. And that work has led to real breakthroughs. We helped end state subsidies for trash incineration by removing it from Maryland's renewable portfolio standard. We also secured $4 million in federal infrastructure funding to build composting capacity in Baltimore, and won commitments from major institutional food waste generators to support a facility that meets community and labor standards. But we also filed a Title VI civil rights complaint challenging the city's continued use of public funds to support incineration that imposes discriminatory burdens on South Baltimore residents. And one outcome of this was the first increase in Baltimore's landfill tipping fee since the 1990s, correcting a long-standing inequity and generating an estimated of $8 to $10 million annually in new public revenue. Next slide, please. And at the same time, we've built our own research capacity, capable of responding directly to what residents see and experience on a daily occasion. We documented visible emission violations at the medical waste incinerator investigated incinerator ash and landfill practices, and produced new analysis showing more than 100 million in health damages from Baltimore's two incinerators. That evidence also helped us persuade a major institution to cut ties with the medical waste incinerator. Next slide, please.
Y'all are at about 5 minutes.
Okay, almost. We'll wrap up soon. Thank you. So, our work in South Baltimore has also helped shape statewide community impact policy, which includes the Cherish Our Communities Act to prevent further harms in community that are already overburdened. And to finish off, next slide, please. We are at another critical moment. Baltimore City is proposing roughly $20 million in waste-related capital spending, and that money could move us closer to zero waste, or it could repeat past mistakes through landfill expansion, increased rail transfers, or mixed waste processing. And our focus is to ensure that the next phase of investment reflects what we've learned by building the evidence and guardrails and accountability needed for a just transition. And that should round up our slides. And thank you all for allowing me to speak today. And
Thank you, Greg and Carlos. I'm going to turn it over now to Bianca Lopez, co-founder of Valley Improvement Projects. Bianca.
Hi, good evening. I use she, her, pronouns, or evening, afternoon, morning. I don't know, we're in different spaces here. Sorry. I'm also feeling under the weather, but thank you for allowing me to tell my story here, and hopefully it can bring some light to some of the efforts that you are all working across the region. Acknowledging, all the other cumulative impacts that our communities are exploring. And that's kind of how Valley Improvement Project started. We were all volunteers working to, find our role in the community. And as we were doing that through community barbecues and doing Know Your Rights workshops when police were harassing Black and brown young men in the downtown area, we met a family who was fighting against the entire incinerator that happened in Wesley, which is a very rural farm working community in the southern end of our county. And then they also said, well, by the way, there's another incinerator. It's a waste to energy facility ran by Covanta. And so we started to, look into the health effects of what they're emitting. They were emitting lots of material that is very toxic, including dioxin, NOx, ammonia, and lead. And there's a list. The list goes on. And unfortunately, here in the state of California and the federal government has allowed incinerators to continue to pollute our communities and set standards that are not set to address health issues or health standards. Those standards are set for capacity of the facility. And so we started to learn more about the incinerator and how it affects our air quality. And that was our first project, environmental justice project. We were much more about social justice, but realizing that social justice and environmental justice go hand in hand and are inseparable. We started to learn about the history of the incinerator and the fight of the residents who are directly affected. And we found that there was a report written by a consultant. It's called the Sorrell Associates Report for Political Difficulties Facing Waste to Energy Conversion. And I'm going to put it put the link in the chat. But basically, this report allowed and informed these industry that said that there is a community that is less likely to resist incinerators, right? And those are poor communities. Those are farm working communities. These are poor people. These are people who don't have higher education because we have the less resources to fight back. And so this Sorrell report very much informed where these facilities are placed. And you heard the first presenters and the introduction sharing how the incinerators are located in disadvantaged communities. Well, that is true across the nation. It is not an accident. It is intentionally done so. And so over 80% of the incinerators that are here in the United States are in disadvantaged environmental justice communities, people of color. And so as of December 2nd, our campaign had ended to shut down the incinerator. That was the last day the incinerator was allowed to burn. And we did that through starving this beast. At first we started to do know your rights stuff, but then just the right to know of what is being emitted in our communities. What are we breathing and how is that affecting us, and educating community members about those effects. And then we started to advocate for curbside recycling. And actually, we learned through our research that the city of Modesto, where I live, sorry, I didn't even state where I was. I'm in Stanislaus County, in the northern central valley here in California. In the state of California, we had 3 incinerators, one in Long Beach, one in Commerce, and then one here in Stanislaus County. The one in Commerce closed a few years back because they were no longer economically feasible. And then the one in Long Beach shut down after we passed a policy, AB 1857, that reclassified recycling. And so incineration was no longer considered recycling. And so these municipalities, jurisdictions that were getting diversion credits were no longer able to get those credits. And so then Covanta became a system that was no longer economically feasible, not just for Covanta, but for the jurisdictions as well. Because we actually had to think about how we were going to recycle and actually recycle, not burn, and keep this material out of the landfill. There are other policies in California that helped starve that beast. We also removed incineration from our renewable credits. We also created here in California a policy that set standards for a diversion rate and green waste recycling. Most recently, we've had SB 1383 that requires all municipalities to divert their green waste from the landfill by having a green bin for curbside recycling. And we also have now SB 54, which is a producer responsibility bill or act that requires producers to create material that is actually recyclable. Now, recycling isn't going to save us, and we know that. So zero waste is what we are focusing on. So while we worked really hard to pass policy and to starve this beast, we didn't think we were going to be so successful so early. We thought that the incinerator was going to shut down in 2027 at the end of its contract. But our policy made that happen much earlier. And even though we had been advocating to our local jurisdictions for over 10 years that we must have a plan to divert waste from the landfill and the incinerator, our efforts were not taken into consideration by these jurisdictions. And now that the incinerator has shut down, we are scrambling to catch up and to have a plan. Valley Improvement Projects with community members created a zero waste plan in 2023, held workshops to learn about what other communities are doing, because not everybody has an incinerator. And we know that we can keep things out of the landfill because it has been done and it is being done in various communities. And we want it to be one of those communities. Working with zero waste was very fruitful. We actually produced a zero waste plan that we can share in the chat as well. They helped us create just a better understanding of the waste that we're producing and where it might end up. And so we also found that we're not recording properly here at local jurisdictions what is the waste that we are creating. But now, after the incinerator has shut down, we are we created a table with the Stanislaus County, which is a very conservative area, if I can add. This is a farming community. Industry is very much the lead here, and our board of supervisors are farmers, have some stake in the farming industry, and so that has just been very difficult in general and like the political atmosphere. But I think they understand now that without the incinerator, we actually do have to reduce the waste that we are producing because we can't. Farmers don't want us to take up their land, right? We don't want to take up more land either. And so looking at what sustainable practices would look like, one of them is zero waste. And so we have started recently a zero waste working group where we're going to be further exploring our zero waste plan to see how we can actually implement some of those things in our zero waste plan, some of those policies and some of those programs and projects that would actually keep things from the landfill, including local policies that government needs to follow, right? Like so we're proposing that when a city and a county host an event, that it must be a zero waste event, and that we are intentional. So those are just some examples of what we're doing now after the incinerator. We are hopeful that the zero waste plan will be implemented here in the near future, and we are excited to see all of these incinerators transition to zero waste because it's possible.
Thank you so much, Bianca. Now I'm passing it over to KT Morelli, organizer at Breathe Free Detroit.
Hi, thank you. Let's see. So I just want to thank you all for having us here, and my heart and many hearts here in Detroit go out to you and your communities in Minneapolis who are facing so many injustices. I'm going to talk today about a just transition to zero waste, and it starts by shutting down an incinerator. As Bianca just mentioned, all of those chemicals that are coming out and that we're breathing in from incinerating trash, you could see them here listed on this stencil. A lot of the images in this presentation were made by community members fighting the incinerator here in Detroit, Michigan. Next slide. Breathe Free Detroit is a community and grassroots-led campaign that was formed to shut down the Detroit incinerator. And after 33 years of community activism from many organizations along the way, on March 27th of 2019, the Detroit Renewable Power Incinerator shut down for good. I'm going to go over a few powerful strategies that we use to shut down this beast in hopes that it may be useful for your fight. Next slide. We created this document to summarize a larger report that we published about the incinerator and included it in our door-to-door efforts, which engaged residents and informed them of their individual power to report odor and pollution concerns. This one-pager also helped inform community of health effects that incineration causes and how our incinerator was a prime example of environmental racism. Next slide. With support from Ocelot Print Shop, our local printmakers, we created and plastered these signs throughout our community that listed the odor complaint call number and also the mayor's phone number. Multiple calls from our community residents reporting odor concerns led to over 800 violations recorded by the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. The signs hung on light poles and other public spaces where you could regularly smell these odors. So folks who were just simply walking by had access to the numbers to actually make a change. It was a great way to take action to fight the stink in our neighborhood. Next slide. I'm going to go over the next 3 slides, and there's a ton of information about this citizen lawsuit that I want you all to be able to take screenshots of, but I'm going to just summarize a few things on these next few slides. Sorry, the amount of print in here, but this is all really important information. One of the major efforts that led to all of those violations, the local environmental law firm, the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center, led a citizen suit and issued an intent to sue letter to the operators of our incinerator for ongoing repeated violations that were being called in by our community. And these are violations also of the Clean Air Act. And the Clean Air Act allows citizens to step into the shoes of regulators and sue a facility when it is not in compliance and when the regulatory agency is not doing their job adequately. The intent to sue letter went out with a 60-day waiting period to see if they will come into compliance or settle within this time. And with only 5 days remaining, the incinerator announced it was closing, stating it was not financially viable to continue operations as is, and it was too expensive to correct the pollution control issues to be good neighbors. Next slide. We saw it in this citizen suit. a federal court order requiring the facility to make whatever physical or operational changes to the incinerator that are necessary to end the violations, and a civil penalty large enough to ensure that the incinerator owners and operators had not profited by avoiding or delaying spending the money necessary to comply with the Clean Air Act permit. The incinerator was located right next to the residential neighbors and in downtown Detroit, similar to yours in Minneapolis. We were suing to keep Detroit residents from being exposed to highly toxic pollutants and respiratory irritants. Violations of high carbon monoxide emissions from the incinerator indicated that there is incomplete combustion of the trash it was burning. And when there's incomplete combustion, incinerators emit higher levels of toxic and cancer-causing pollutants. Next slide. So we took this action because MDEQ and EPA had not taken action themselves and to end these violations, which is precisely the situation that Congress had in mind when it put the citizen enforcement provision into the Clean Air Act. Next slide. So with all this, I really want to emphasize the community-led policy. And globally, environmental justice communities are leaders in creating solutions for climate justice. Many AJ communities implement these solutions out of resistance and are experts in knowing what to do next. Detroit residents impacted by the incinerator are a great example of an environmental justice community who created a variety of solutions to the environmental racism that resulted in the city's burning trash facility closure. Additionally, my community just downwind of the now closed incinerator had been practicing zero waste as an act of resistance years before the incinerator closed. Since we knew that whatever we threw into our trash, we'd be breathing right back in once it was burned. Yet when the incinerator shut down, there was no plan that the city had for diverting materials to zero waste systems. Next slide.
You're at 5 minutes.
Thank you. I just have one more slide after this. Appreciate. So this, I just wanted to share with you, Detroit was one of the last major cities to implement curbside recycling, and this is a theme you hear from other cities, due to a contractual obligation that sent all municipal waste to the incinerator. The charts you see here on the screen are from the year the incinerator shut down. And on the left, you'll see that Detroit's incinerator was burning 91.6% of its waste. And once it closed, the waste was sent to a landfill. And as you can see, less than 5% of Detroit's waste was diverted for recycling, and composting diversion was only 3.5%. On the right is the breakdown that of what we could have been diverting, and you'll see that 80% of that waste was sent to our incinerator, then could have been diverted into zero waste systems. But incineration requires all of our waste to continue its operations, as all waste is the much needed fuel to run an incinerator at capacity. And since the closure, Detroit's recycling efforts have doubled both in our diversion rate and doubled in the amount of participants choosing to recycle at home. So last slide, and I finally want to share with you guys that as the city of Detroit continues to work with community leaders and environmental advocates to increase zero waste efforts, I look back on our win as an ever-looming shadow, in that my family and neighbors still suffer from the harms incineration inflicted onto our communities for over 33 years, even though it's closed. We still have these toxins in our lungs, our blood, and in our children. The first step toward healing generational harms and building thriving communities is to shut down your incinerator. Then the real work of just transition into zero waste can start. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, KT. And last but not least, I'm going to pass it back to Isra Nasir Khan, Executive Director of Minnesota Environmental Justice Table and also part of the Zero Burn Coalition.
Can you all see the slides?
Not yet.
Okay. Try that again. Sorry. Is that working now? Yep, sweet.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, just a couple slides to just show you some pictures of the facility and our campaign kind of timeline. But yeah, I'm Nazir. I use he pronouns, and I've been involved in this fight for the last 6 years. Um, I'd say the main reason we took this on, and it was a group of like 3 to 5 people meeting starting in late 2019 every week for years, and it just grew and grew and grew from there. And now there's 70 organizations, hundreds of community members, labor unions, faith groups. Uh, yeah, just has become a really big coalition. And last night I was at a DF like a Democratic caucus event, and people were like just on their own bringing up HERC, and it was like it's become really like a signature like issue in our even in this moment under assault. And so yeah, I mean like just echoing what Baltimore was saying. We have we were told at the start, there's this people have tried, this campaign has been going on really for 40 years because HERC was almost 40 years. HERC was built in 1989. Um, and and yeah, it's gone through a pandemic within a few months of starting to meet. That happened. There was an uprising from the murder of George Floyd back in June of 2020. And it keeps going even through this moment. We've stayed steady. And so one of the reasons that that's happened, and think we've been careful over the years to talk about this, but what's happened since this first whistleblower came to us is others have come as well. Um, but someone came to us with serious concerns about the facility and information, and we started to do data requests. This because this is it's owned by Hennepin County, which is the city, it's the county that Minneapolis is in. It's often like perceived as a kind of progressive liberal entity. Also was notorious during Standing Rock because county sheriffs were sent to Standing Rock to attack protesters. But so there's this like two sides to the county, but yeah, it led to us doing a bunch of data requests and finding a lot of information around which we'll get into later around violations and um most recently we learned that 2 workers were killed fixing the facility, and all of this was covered up, hidden away. When we go to county staff or county commissioners, initially there was sort of interest, but over time we found that we've been tuned out. They don't want to hear it. The issue's too complicated. Where's the waste going to go? All these sort of like bureaucratic, technical policy questions that are put on us to figure out. And so yeah, this is also just where the trash burner is located. Before I continue, it's right, like kind of in the center of Minneapolis, as you could see, next to um, the Minnesota Twins stadium. That's the baseball team. It's actually like you can see here, it's like attached almost to this. It like is basically attached to the stadium. There's a light rail that goes right by it, and a lot of people don't even realize that's an incinerator because it's attached to the stadium, and you could see Target Field Station on that left, but it's right at the heart of the city. That river going right by is the Mississippi River. This is, just context, like consider the birthplace of the Oceti-Sacoan, the Sioux people. Um, and yeah, very like important place in the like the kind of geography of the Midwest. Um, and this is just a timeline, which I won't go too much into, but just kind of going all the way back to before 1989. This fight started, and we have continued it. We've really built on the lessons. Something that might touch on earlier is a lot of the work of unearthing, like the truth about this incinerator, hasn't just been current day, but like the work of finding articles from little newspapers like The Alley, which talked about how the incinerator, its emissions were also blowing into the south side of Minneapolis. The north side is the community that we've kind of most been organizing in, because that's where Black folks in particular have been segregated, especially after the 60s race riots. And it's where they decided to build the burner when they knew it was already a segregated community, already a overpolluted community. And yeah, from the beginning, we've learned that after it was built, bus drivers talked about, and also bus drivers talked about increase in diarrhea for their kids, and nurses talked about a huge spike in bronchial infections. That was like in the months after the incinerator, people noticed these changes in health conditions.
About
Um,
5 minutes.
cool. I think I'm pretty much done. Yeah, I'll get into later, hopefully, just how the campaign has gone. We've just like kind of where we are currently. We got, you can see here in 2023, after a lot of pressure, we forced the county board to pass a resolution to close HERC. And the way that happened was sort of like emblematic of the campaign, where we have like a county board and a county that pretends, or like puts on this front of being progressive, and maybe in some ways it is, but on this issue, um, they passed this closure resolution. But when we looked at the fine print, it said it was a plan for it was a resolution for a closure plan. And what's happened since then is they've created the closure plan, and it's been 2 years now, and they're just more than 2 years sitting on this closure plan and refusing to implement it, basically. And so these are the sorts of kind of games and deceptiveness that we've been dealing with, and it's really confused the community. A lot of people think the HERC is in the midst of being closed, and that's just not true. There is nothing that holds them legally to close the HERC. They would have to pass a new resolution actually to initiate the closure plan, and that's part of the reason why we committed to launch a hunger strike if they don't begin that process, is partly because they've been so effective at confusing the community that we feel it necessary to call everyone's attention to the fact that things are not moving forward. And it's been like really a game of confusing people and making it seem like things are moving when they're not. But yeah, thanks. And I'll just say one last thing, just kind of as a little bit of intro, to building off of what Asuru was saying. Like, we also learned so much from these campaigns, the Baltimore campaign, the Detroit campaign, more recently from Bianca's campaign. In particular, when Detroit shut its incinerator down in 2019, that's when we were getting started, and it was such an inspiring thing. And when you're dealing with public officials and industry that like tell you, like, the poison you're breathing is not really, it's not poison, it's actually coming from the highways, when they tell you it's safe, it's under its permitted levels. It's been so important to see. I think it's part of why we've persisted, even though like other fights came and went in our localities, is the solidarity and the learnings between the different groups that are simultaneously fighting this issue across the country. Like, it's been so inspiring for us, both like in terms of keeping the faith and learning strategies for how to do this. So just wanted to name that, because that's a big part of today. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Nazir. So we're going to turn it over to our panel now. I just have 5 questions before we open up the floor for questions. So the first question is for South Baltimore Community Land Trust, but others feel free to jump in after. What are some key things your campaign unearthed that revealed the true dangers and harms of incineration?
Yeah, I can start, and then Carlos, you can jump in. We'll keep it. We should keep these fairly brief, just as responses. So yeah, I mean, a couple just examples. I mean, there's a lot, but a couple of examples that are going on that are very active now have to do with something that we're finding is a really under-examined aspect of the whole incineration racket or systems, which is that they're really I think just going to break this down really in a basic way. They burn a lot of material that could be recycled or composted, and then they put a lot of it into the air, and then a lot of it's left over as ash, which then has to go somewhere. And in our case in South Baltimore, it doesn't go far. Most of it goes to the city-owned landfill. So it's a private incinerator that benefits from city and county contracts, so from public money. And then it's a form of revenue for the Baltimore city government because the incinerator is paying the city government a tip fee to put that material in a landfill. So in some instances, when we've really been pushing on this, the city has come forward and said, well, if we don't have this incinerator, we'll be losing X millions of dollars in city revenue. So we knew there was something here, but when you're dealing with the giant smokestack and the visible emissions sometimes, and that we've historically not put as much energy into what's going on with the ash, how is it regulated? Is it really being regulated at all? Is it really being tested at all? Can we trust any of the information we're being given? And with a mix of methods, so one is just basic Public Information Act requests, what we're already finding is that this is the largest volume tonnage material going to the landfill. So the city landfill is getting about 400,000+ tons, and the ash represents close to 200,000 tons of what's going to the city landfill each year. And it's supposed to be put into dedicated cells. If things are going right in this broken system, that's what would be happening. But what appears to be the case is that they are, and this is what we're learning through the PIA requests, is that despite the state continuing to, in a very tepid way, say you ought not to do it the way you're doing it, the city is using it as daily landfill cover as a replacement for clean soil, what's supposed to be soil. Which of course, just if you think about it, that then presents an exposure risk where that ash can become airborne and trespass outside of the limits of the landfill into the adjacent communities, which are the same communities that are overburdened with all the other things we're talking about. So that coupled with how is the ash actually being stored at the facility and then transported a few miles from point A to point B, what's going on there? So those are some of the originating from community observation saying it doesn't, people who work at the landfill, who work at the different routes in between, kind of pointing to some of this stuff, is just leading to a whole kind of ball of wax that we're starting to dig into, and just say stay tuned for more information. But this is another one of the power of just more people working on this across lines of division, is that I think what we're finding is a lot of these they're, as others have said, these are not unique to Baltimore or Detroit or Minneapolis or Los Angeles, is that there's a pattern, because these are not bugs, these are features of how you run a system at this scale when you're using these technologies. And just another one, just really quickly, was the medical waste incinerator, which is it's the neighbor to the city landfill. They, through workers being whistleblowers, were pled guilty to 40 criminal counts, including not actually burning the material at all through COVID, right? So that they could have a larger throughput and just burn, not fully burn. And then workers at the other end were having to go through the ash, pull out human remains and other things, and then truck it back up to Baltimore from Virginia to be burned again. So they got the largest environmental fine in Maryland history. What the community then did was to say, well, we're not assuming, given the track record, that the story ends there. So we did a very simple thing and tied a trail camera to a tree just to start monitoring what's going on when they don't think anyone's looking. And what we've uncovered, this is very similar to KT in the Detroit story, is probably 100 or so instances of visible emissions where it's not even coming out of the smokestack. It's just black smoke coming out of every orifice of the building. And so that's where we are, is that we have this evidence, and it's mounting and it's building on multiple fronts. And we're at the place of, given the level of denialism between company and governments, state and local, we're not thinking so much about federal at this point. We're more in the mode of how do we compel action versus how do we persuade through voluntary action by elected officials. We've been down that road for over a decade now, and we get a lot of great promises. And then in terms of what actually pans out, and it's not that nothing is panned out, but at the scale and the pace that's needed, we're shifting into the mode of how do we gear up to compel action versus expect or hope for it.
Thank you, Greg. I don't know if Carlos had anything more to add, or maybe KT can jump in.
Yeah, sure. One thing, speaking on the ash, one thing we learned is, and this is from the forestry department in Detroit, is that the incinerator facility was stockpiling wood for when the regulators were to come, which they had they knew when they were coming, and so they stockpiled wood and burned that wood to show that their emissions weren't that bad. And the forestry department knew about this and came up to us at city council meetings and said, I don't want to be a whistleblower, but you need to know this is happening. So that made it so much more difficult for us we have to, as community members, share with these public officials that what's actually going on because their numbers, their data isn't actually true. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that like it goes beyond that, not just like for how these facilities are treating community, it's how they even treat their staff. Because one thing that we experienced is when our incinerator shut down, when we learned the day the incinerator shut down, the workers were told not to come back after lunch. And they're like, you don't have a job. We're shutting down. They don't care about the workers. They didn't care that they didn't have a job the next day. And so this is something that we have to understand in this just transition and plan for and have public officials also take into consideration.
Thanks for that, Katie. Bianca, do you have anything to add on that? Any things
Yeah,
you're
yeah, I could add something to that. We found out about the emissions and how these emissions were not set to health standards. That was like the most impactful thing. And so, we started to repeat that no amount of poison or toxic material is healthy, right? And so they set these limits and these standards, but understanding that they're not about our health. They're about capacity for the facility. In 2020, the federal government um, found priority violations of its air permit requirements for the last 4 quarters, and then also exceeding emission limits for nitrogen oxide and sulfur dioxide and carbon monoxide. And so, a lot of folks here we have to educate, like, well, what does that mean, and translate to regular folks. But I think what was more impactful was um helping to demystify like all of the greenwashing that Covanta was doing in our communities about how it's reducing greenhouse gas emissions and how it's recycling and how it's keeping things out of the landfill. That's kind of what we focused a lot on is, yeah, you might recycle thousands of tons of metal, like burning cars, but that's after you burn it and after we've breathed in all that toxic material. So we use those kind of statistics to actually give the alternate view of how it is really not reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And in our zero waste plan, you'll see one of the slides shows the greenhouse emissions listed from Covanta and how we can reduce even more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse contaminants by simply using zero waste practices, right? And so helping to help others understand that Covanto is very good at greenwashing, and all these industries are really good at greenwashing, and helping our local elected officials to understand that was very key for us.
Thanks for that, Bianca. I want to turn it over to KT to answer this question. What kinds of tactics has your opposition used to disrupt your campaign or avoid closing the incinerator?
So there was it's all very similar to what the other folks were experiencing. And um sorry, there they were saying that landfilling is worse than incineration because we all know that landfilling is bad. But in everything you've heard from everybody else is that we're landfilling anyways. We're landfilling toxic ash, and nobody talks about that toxic ash, and nobody brings that up. So that's something that was really important to look into. they also, were relying on that for lower rates of waste for the city and income for the city. We were pulling in waste from different counties. We were pulling in waste from different states, and even Canada was sending us our waste because, as a city, we weren't making enough for the facility to even burn at capacity. And so these things are just, they require waste to burn. So it made it so we couldn't recycle. It made it so we couldn't implement composting programs because we were fighting this facility that was requiring all of that in order for the combustion to happen correctly, even though the boilers were getting so old that it wasn't happening correctly towards the end of its life. So, yeah, there was so much more, but I'll let other folks speak on this too.
Yeah, does anyone at South Baltimore Community Land Trust want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, sort of similar to what KT said, it's, these facilities, especially for case of Brasco as well, or in Baltimore, they require waste, right? They require us sending them a certain amount of waste to them. Like I said earlier, that the one in Baltimore, they get from Baltimore City and Baltimore County, and they actually, one of the things that they did was actually suing the incinerator sued the county for I think more than $30 million for not sending enough waste and basically using their money and legal power to intimidate the government and keep them in line. And it shows to how much power that they have to literally intimidate our officials, which increases the challenge that we have of trying to reduce the waste that we're sending and moving towards more zero waste composting facilities.
Thanks for that, Carlos. We're just going to jump to this next question here. Maybe Bianca, you can jump in. How has the success of your campaigns helped catalyze the zero waste transition in your community, and where are you in that transition? I know you kind of touched a little bit on your presentation, but I'd like to hear a little more.
Yeah, so the county and the jurisdictions, they don't have a public space where they're talking about our contracts with waste haulers. They're not creating a public space where we can give them our opinion. It's simply only allowed when they're going to increase our rates, right? Like for curbside recycling. And it's not even up for a debate, like, oh, every year they renew this. So we kept going to Board of Supervisor meetings and City Council meetings to say, okay, so the incinerator shut down, what's the plan? Because you were talking about how you don't want a landfill, but yet you don't have a plan to keep things out of the landfill. And so we kept calling them out on this, and we said, the county here, I don't know what it's like for other folks, but there are regional advisory committees where all of the jurisdictions have to come together to have a 5-year plan to keep things out of the landfill. It's called the EAR, and I don't know what it stands for, sorry. Then there are the county is like the rep for the unincorporated areas or towns, and the county is like the lead agency who's supposed to be complying with state regulation for diversion rates, right, and assisting these smaller jurisdictions to comply and to comply. So those meetings were also being canceled because they didn't have any quorum. And so for a while, even before the incinerator shut down, we were advocating for these local meetings to actually have a public facing space where even if you don't have quorum, people should be able to come and ask questions and talk about waste concerns. But we couldn't even have those conversations in those spaces either. And so we kept insisting that we needed a space where the people can actually be part of the solution and not just, react after they implement some plan, if they implemented anything. So we just kept pushing the issue. And now we have, with the county, a space where we're talking about zero waste with haulers, we have just community members, we have jurisdictions. They're kind of listening. They're not really bought in necessarily. They're still a little skeptical because we're never going to get to zero waste, right? And so that perspective does seem like it's changing a little bit, because we're actually showing them, using other examples from other communities of how they are doing some of this work and keeping some of this material, building coalitions to keep the conversation going and building capacity with our local jurisdictions to be able to divert waste from the landfill by implementing new policies and new practices with new expectations from our community members. At first, the county was saying, we're too dumb and we're too poor to care. And that's not true. And so, having this space with the Zero Waste Working Group is definitely proving that people are willing to be at the table to be part of the solution. And that's very exciting for us to be able to learn from communities across the country.
Thanks, Bianca. I do want to turn it over to KT because you all did shut down your incinerator in Detroit, and you have progressed. So would want to hear a little bit more about how it's going.
Yeah, as I mentioned in the slides, we've doubled our recycling efforts and doubled the participation of recycling. We have an opt-in recycling program where, I have goals for it to be an opt-out program, so that's a difficult issue in itself. But there's been really big movement towards creating a zero waste plan and incorporating community-led voices. And so the city of Detroit actually held multiple year meetings with community leaders in zero waste and created a zero waste plan and outlined a series of goals and timeline to achieve them. And then Breathe Free Detroit also led a composting effort in 2020 to 2023, and it centered our community's efforts in zero waste and aided the city in understanding the importance of leading zero waste efforts that are decentralized and multi-scale, especially in composting. And that pilot was actually really pivotal because now the city itself uses the phrase multi-scale decentralized composting efforts. And we're now working with the Detroit Community Composting Collective pilot project, which is working with urban farms and larger institutional, like in small scale composting facilities. So there's a lot of hope in building this as we're moving zero waste forward. And just to show folks that it's possible. We don't need these big facilities. At the same time, we're getting a mega recycling facility that just was built next to our incinerator that was torn down. Or still stands half torn down, let's be real. But that facility itself, our community was so engaged in fighting for the rights of environmental justice that we all came together so quickly to make a letter of demands for this new facility by Waste Management, and have make sure that there's designed truck routes and that there's reduced air pollution and more. And our letter from all these community leaders that we gathered together and sent to the city cost Waste Management over $20 million of changes. So, the efforts that communities face after an environmental justice win are also so important to move it forward. And our community is geared up to continue to fight because we've seen what happens when we actually put all these efforts together and see a facility shut down. So feeling a little unstoppable at this point, which is a good thing.
Thanks for that, KT. And I think we'll just jump to the final question here. What is the importance of solidarity and connections within our movement to stop incinerators and reduce waste? Feel free to jump in, anyone.
One thing that's top of mind for us in Baltimore right now is that through the medical waste incinerator, we're receiving waste from maybe not every state on this call, but many of the states. And Canada is also dumping waste into Baltimore. And we realize very well that when we're successful in shutting down both the medical waste and then the Bresco incinerator, that there's a real risk that it'll accelerate the process of shipping waste out of Baltimore to other places. And so I think one of the only real antidotes to that scenario is forming stronger solidarity and action across sacrifice zones so that we're able to know in advance, anticipate, and work accordingly. It's daunting, but I think it's just not acceptable on our end to shut down a facility and then displace the harm onto another place that has so much in common with Curtis Bay or South Baltimore.
I can jump in with a couple of things. I think, yeah, I said it at the start, but just like learning the strategies that folks used in these different fights has been really helpful to us. And I think like just to point to like a somewhat like technical kind of like thing, but the Detroit lawsuit to shut down its incinerator was a lot of it premised around the carbon monoxide, the hundreds of carbon monoxide violations, which demonstrated the facility was not burning properly. There was incomplete combustion. And we've been looking into that with the HERC, and actually really recently we've been finding similar violations, but also realizing our permit is actually weaker than the Detroit permit because it's a 1 hour. There's a they have to they have like a 1 hour limit basically, and we have like a day long limit. So it allows them to spike, and then they like reduce how much they're burning or change things up so that they don't like violate. But even then, they still are violating. And so we're actually like we're introducing a bill this session to address that and strengthen the permit. So just like a very kind of technical one, but I think like an example of how we've learned. And then the other one I wanted to bring up, which somebody I think we can expand on it a little bit, but just really quickly, because I think it was Noel asked, who's in Miami dealing with the new incinerator they're trying to build there in the Everglades, about yeah, this binary choice between landfills and incinerators. And and so I want to bring up like this network that Gaia has is not just national, it's global. And so I've been very like lucky, like the place that my mother is from in India, there's a Gaia organization there called Funnel, and they have been building and really like popularizing this idea of decentralized waste management, which I see Stephanie Booker has already mentioned in the chat. And I really see that as the solution. And they talk about it like that. They don't have landfills or incinerators in that part of Kerala. And what they do is they manage the waste close to where it's generated. They really try to, even to the level of apartment buildings, have their own compost set up. So making people responsible for their own waste, not sending it to what become sacrifice zones, giant landfills or incinerators. And I think that's the solution. And actually what we've seen, it's been really inspiring in Minnesota is like we have cities now interested. There's students at the University of Minnesota who've started spreading the word. It's really kind of like catching on here. And so I just wanted to lift that up and also as an example of like these like the movement building and solidarity and learnings can really like shift things.
Thanks, Nazir. Bianca?
Well, I think being in solidarity and supporting each other is really important because these aren't just things that are happening in these isolated communities or in various isolated communities. This is a fossil fuel industry issue that we're fighting against, and they want to keep extracting to create new material and more material to continue to profit with at the expense of our health in our communities. And so, it's not just because they're in their community and they're not in my community. And that doesn't mean that I'm not going to continue to fight for those types of systems to stop coming and being allowed to continue to pollute and justify the need for continuous extraction. And I think that's really important for folks who don't have an incinerator near them, that we are all part of the same fight. It might just not look the same for us. And so some of us need to learn where we can, how we can be in solidarity with those that are directly near the fight.
Thanks, Bianca. And thank you to our panel for sharing their insights and thoughtful discussion. It's always a pleasure to be on a call with you all. And we'll now open it up for questions. I'll pass it to Nazir. We have a few in the Q&A.